On this episode of Mythbusters, we are delving deep into ancient philosophy to discover how animals perceive the world. We will grapple with such questions as, how do they really perceive the world around them, and what are the limits to this capacity? Do animals merely see colors and shapes and act on instinct to survive, or do they see properties that go beyond the initial sense perception?
So what's the myth?
Well, the myth today focuses on how animals perceive the world and what's the extent of that perception. In ancient Greece, Aristotle found it his task to understand the mystery of how animals interact with the world. While he wrote many works on this subject, his work De Anima deals with animal perception and will be our source for this investigation.
Isn't it right to assume that animals can see particular things beyond, like color, motion, and shape? They can't really survive if they can't tell the difference between a predator and a prey.
Well, common sense can explain a reasonable conclusion, but how we get to that conclusion is a bit more complicated. In the context of Aristotle's theory of perception, different possibilities arise that lead to different conclusions. We will test the conclusions on different interpretations of Aristotle and see if one holds true empirically. So, how correct was Aristotle about his conception of animals? Since the myth is about Aristotle's theory of animal perception, we should start by first understanding his theory and then testing it on a living animal. So let's start. According to Aristotle, animals have the capacity for perception and nutrition, but do not have the capacity for rational thought. He describes 3 types of objects of perception. Of these types, 2 are objects perceived in themselves. Of these, the first are objects special to various senses, meaning that each sense organ is affected by its specific sensible. Second, there are objects common to all senses. There is not one special sense for common senses, nor is it special to any one sense, but common to all. Some examples are movement, number, rest, figure, and size. So one can perceive movement by both sight and touch. Next, we have objects perceived incidentally. All other objects of perception belong to this category. Incidental perception occurs when an object is recognized as either a particular or an indeterminate instance of a universal. Incidental perception coincides with the sensing of special or common sensibles. Using Aristotle's example, we can see that one's eye sees a white object in itself as a white object, but the perceiver perceives simultaneously and incidentally that it is Cleon's sun. Unlike the special and common senses, there is no naturally ordered sense for incidental perceptions. It is for this reason that they are perceived incidentally.
What does this say about Pup and how he perceives the world?
Since all animals have the capacity of perception, it would seem to follow that animals can sense special, common, and incidental sensibles.
How far can they go in this perception?
It is here where we find the debate on whether animals can have incidental perceptions or not. While there are many positions on this particular topic, for our investigation we will only briefly examine 2 possibilities. The inferentialists claim that we directly perceive the things in themselves, and the indirect perception of incidentals is only by inference from more basic perceptual beliefs to direct perception. This means that this inference can only be inferred by rational beings, limiting animals' perception to special and common sensibles. So when your dog is chasing a rabbit, he is only seeing a gray blur in motion and does not recognize it as a rabbit. The second position one can take is a teleological account. With this account, each sense organ acts towards its own particular end, which is fulfilled in the in-itself sensation of its special sense object. The difference between something perceived in itself or perceived incidentally is found in whether the sense perceiving that object is for that particular object. Since incidental perceptions are perceived through senses that are not naturally ordered to it, they are coincident to special and common sensibles, but not inferred. Here, non-rational animals do have the capability to perceive incidental perceptibles.
Then how far does that perception go? Like, will an animal perceive that this particular dog is pup? Or how about an indeterminate instances of universals, like, is this dog a particular dog among many dogs? Will they know that?
Well, it's here where the inferentialist fear arises. It seems that in recognizing a particular or an instance of a universal implies a type of cognitive process. Now we have come to our test. Will pup understand that the ball thrown is the same particular ball that falls? We first threw the initial ball and after threw the second ball. Since he only perceives ball as what bounces in front of him, he heads to the ball that fell on the ground, not realizing it is not the ball initially thrown. Will pup perceive that although this is shaped like a ball, it is not a particular instance of this universal? We shaped the snow into a ball and threw it to him. Since he bases his perception on the common sensible of shape, he does not know the universal concept of ball. These experiments mostly reveal that particulars and instances of universals are not perceived by a non-rational animal.
So going back, if an animal can't perceive incidental perceptions, then how do they survive? Like, how do they tell the difference between predator and prey?
So one solution is to claim that the animal may perceive incidentals in a different way than what has been previously mentioned. Although animals may not be able to see particulars or universals, the animal must be able to perceive certain phenomena as distinct objects in some way. So the ability for this distinction and perception of incidentals can be found within the context of what Aristotle calls fantasia. Fantasia can be roughly translated as imagination. It is what happens when we call up mental images that we have previously perceived. Fantasia is unlike perception in that it does not require the presence of the sensible object, but attaches to in itself perceptions. Aristotle claims that non-rational animals are guided by fantasia. Fantasia calls up prior perceptions of the animals, and these can be special, common, or incidental. Also included with these prior perceptions is pleasure or pain. The association of pleasure or pain with a sense object is done by the appetite through the initial sense recollection through imagination. Thus, with fantasia, something can be associated indirectly with its incidental perception. The hoot of an owl is associated with a predator, which would bring pain to its prey. Then, by fantasia, the prey identifies the sound of the owl, which is perceived in itself, with the incidental perception that it is an owl. In this way, animals are able to have incidental perceptions with fantasia. While these incidental perceptions may not be the exact way in which humans have incidental perceptions, because they do not have the rational faculty, they are able to perceive incidentals based on prior experience and make connections and distinctions through fantasia.
But how do we test this?
Well, we already tested and saw that Puck can't recognize a particular or an instance of a universal. So now let's see if he can recognize a ball through fantasia. We will begin by showing him a blue and red ball. Then we'll remove this ball from his sight. We'll place the ball among other balls. For the myth to be plausible, he must be able to use fantasia to choose the correct ball. He did it! While our experiment may have other factors showing that this myth isn't undeniably true, we can at least see that the empirical evidence makes Aristotle's theory at least plausible on a teleological account. It also shows that the inferentialist interpretation could not hold to a positive test.